I'm so grateful to be in Singapore because Singapore has a very unusual reputation in the world for being a place where there is social and economic stability, and also where there's great accomplishment in the areas of the environment, public housing, education, and medicine. It's really a fascinating place for me to visit, in part because my background in anthropology has me appreciate cultural diversity. And indeed, there is a great deal of cultural diversity in this environment. I also want to express my gratitude to Cindy and Meng, and to Soren, and also the many threads in my life, including the Mind and Life Institute, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, my various teachers, and most especially to the opportunity to study with some great social psychologists and neuroscientists. And the image that you see on this slide is of a woman from Gorkha, where in 2013, we held a number of large medical camps for people of this very remote area of Nepal, which has been profoundly affected by the recent earthquake. So since the 25th of April, I've been extremely involved in fundraising to help the aid process in Gorkha particularly. And also, fascinatingly enough, part of that has been an extreme immersion into Facebook. Just as Twitter was the social platform for Egypt and Tahrir Square, Facebook has been the social platform that people in Nepal have used, young people in Nepal have used to magnetize each other and resources in this process of bringing aid to remote areas of Nepal that have been affected by the earthquakes. And I have the images here because we live in a very safe, beautiful setting in our lives. The situation in Nepal is something where I feel gratitude from learning about leadership from the people of Nepal in the mountains. What it is to have a kind of robustness, resilience, hardiness, humor, fairness as they live their lives. So my topic today is leading from compassion. And compassion is a very interesting word in the world of social media, in the world of corporations, even in the world of medicine. And the question comes up, how can we actually cultivate compassionate and principled leadership in the world today and open that up for young leaders? And I see that there are 4 dimensions that are really important. One of them is systems thinking. How do we see things from the point of view of interconnectedness? How do we understand that breakdown in systems actually signifies robustness? That systems that are moribund don't break down. In fact, breakdown is a really important aspect in a living system. Also, how can we understand that living systems are really alive because emergence is the process, that the element of surprise is always in operation. And as some of you know, I've worked in the end-of-life care field since 1970. And my job in that world has been to introduce the kind of thinking and work that was described in the previous session. How do we actually open up qualities within the experience of clinicians that allows them to flourish in supporting dying people, supporting people with catastrophic illness? And I also have brought this work into the penitentiary system in New Mexico. So systems thinking teaches us that It's very important for us to have a kind of person-to-person relationship, but it's also to understand that whatever we bring to one person is actually having a systemic impact. Another element that is really important in the whole world of leadership is not just systems thinking, but it's the cultivation, the intentional cultivation of moral sensitivity. And as well, trust. Trust in oneself, trust in one's team, trust in the corporation that we're working in, trust in the medical system, some kind of trust in the corrections system, trust in our government, and so forth. And the last piece that I just want to mention in this very condensed summary is the value of collaboration. How do we work together to steward not just the earth or not just the institutions in which we work, but also how to steward each other and how we can really understand that this is, as our presenters said in the previous session, a process that is about the development of community. So I want to mention a name that has not been invoked here, and a concept that's not been invoked, but it's implicit. And that is the work of Robert Greenleaf. And I've been deeply influenced by Greenleaf's work of servant leadership. How do we understand that we as leaders, I'm the abbot of a monastery. I work in complex medical systems. I work in the corrections systems. I work as a consultant to various corporations and businesses. I have this kind of funny role. I don't usually wear a rock suit. My hair grows really fast, so sometimes I have a hairdo, and sometimes I have a hair don't. But my job basically is as a kind of cultural broker. How do I actually move on the interface of systems and engender these four qualities? A perspective that allows for seeing things systemically, a perspective that is about the development of moral character, a perspective that engenders fundamental trust, and a perspective that honors collaboration. And I'm thinking of the great Zen teacher and wanderer and haiku poet who was asked by a student of his, what's the essence of your practice? And what Basho said, whatever is needed. And I would do an adaptation of that. Whatever will really serve. What is going to serve? And as Nisha mentioned, I'm a person who has a great deal of interest in social platforms in the tech world. Even though I've been in this world of practice since 1965 as a Zen person, Jack and I were just talking about, we met in 1972. So we have some mileage behind us of doing this work. We also both are founders of very robust and complex institutions. And we've explored the path of leadership in these institutions and also touched into the sort of equation of failure, of challenge, of the shadow, of what it means to be a founder in an institution that is about changing culture. Just as you were speaking earlier, our work is not just about changing a person's mind. It is in part that, but it's also about culture change. And yet, we're in a certain way absolutely flooded with distractions and demands via our technology and a kind of co-opting of our attention. This is the weapons of mass distraction. And our attention is, in a certain way, one of our most valuable experiences It's one of our most valuable internal processes. The cultivation of attention that allows us to perceive things really clearly, to sustain our attention for long periods of time on a single thing, is very important in our world today. And the more that our attention is distracted, the more our values are destroyed in a certain way, because we're not able to see reality really clearly. Plus, again, what you were speaking about, our former friends, or our friends in the former session, the enablement of technology to engender a kind of compulsive relationship with our work environments is really fascinating. My assistant gave me for his birthday an Apple Watch, and I just asked him to please to turn off the push notifications. This thing on your wrist that's constantly tickling you in a certain way, coming into the pulse of your life, the natural pulse of your life, and inviting you in an adverse way to reset your attention constantly, which means that more and more glucose gets wicked up in the process of just paying attention, and it is at a cost to our technology. And I want to just bring the words of Pico Iyer, the writer, into the room. He's just a wonderful, high-traveling, slow-moving writer that I met at the last Wisdom 2.0 conference. I've read many of his works, and I just love these words. We're living at the speed of light rather than the speed of life. And our pace is more and more dictated by machines, which is more and more difficult for humans to keep up with. So how do we create the internal conditions where we are enabled by technology, where our memory can be extended, where our knowledge base can be allocated, where our connectivity can be enjoyed and can be implemented, just as my experience with my colleagues in Nepal, which has been a kind of remarkable journey for almost 2 months, where our Zen Center has been a hub of communication for people in the mountains of Nepal where the towers have not been destroyed, where connectivity is essential. How do we at the same time create the internal conditions where we're able to actually stop, where we can take the inhale, as you said, where the inhale of really gathering our attention, the exhale of dropping into our body is not considered to be valueless, but actually discovered to be essential in terms of not only our own well-being, but the well-being of the institutions that we serve in. There's another effect that I think is really important, and this comes out, it's called the Gyges effect. And this is out of the Greek world of myths, where Gyges has a ring that makes him disappear, and therefore he can engage in behavior that is fundamentally unprincipled. And so how does this disappearing face in our technology enable the breakdown of the moral fabric in our corporations and in our personal lives? And how does this facelessness also conduce to the shutdown of compassion? So in the light of this, the question that Soren and Mang and Cindy and the people gathered in this room, what we're looking at is how do we steward the next generation of leaders who we want to be compassionate and wise, and in the midst of very complex work demands, and also the distractions of our technology. And what would leadership be like if it was dedicated to serving humanity and serving this earth? And I think it's significant that the Pope's encyclical has been delivered in the course of this conference. And also that the first day of this conference happened in a setting which exemplified environmental values with super trees, for example, or these sort of, the cloud forests and the flower environment, which are replications of the natural world, but remind us how important it is for us to do our best to steward our earth, particularly at this time when the tops of mountains are being blown off, when water and air is at risk. And so what might be the value of making compassion a norm for leadership? And I say this with a lot of tenderness, if you will, a kind of sense of shyness, because I know that from working in the medical system now for 45 years, strangely enough, and Dr. Yu and Tan, who's here, and other people in the clinical world, know that compassion is in a certain way looked on as a problematic process. And why is compassion important, and what would it take? I mean, the first thing that we know is that we have to get smart about compassion. We have to understand how it transforms suffering in the world. And we also have to not be afraid of compassion. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this really true about compassion? It's dangerous because suffering is catching. You can get overwhelmed. It fatigues you. It makes you sick. You can lose your boundaries. You can be seen as weak or unprofessional, or compassion from the point of view of some individuals actually obscures power dynamics, or it prioritizes sympathy over justice, or I need to take care of myself first. Maybe not. Let's for a moment look at why and how we can shift this meme of compassion potentially and make it a priority for robust, effective, principled leadership. And how do we get there? There are basically 4 steps. The word meaning was articulated at various times in the past day. How do we make meaning from compassion and out of compassion? And how do we map compassion? And then how do we develop methods for actually training compassion and implementing compassion in the institutions and corporations where we serve? And as you said in the earlier session, in a way, this is a movement, a global movement. So let's talk just for a minute about science. I am not a scientist. I want to make that clear from the onset. I'm trained in anthropology, but I was very fortunate in 1980 to meet a remarkable neuroscientist named Francisco Varela, who is one of the founders of Mind and Life. He was a neuroscientist, a philosopher, a phenomenologist, and he was also a long-term Buddhist practitioner. And it was in the course of interacting with Francisco that we conjured up this vision of what would it be like to actually enter into dialogues with adept Buddhist teachers around mental processes that are cultivated in this experience that we call meditation. And out of this work, Mind and Life has arisen, various other institutions have arisen, and individuals all over the world who are looking at compassion from the point of view of science. And as Dr. Ari and I know, it's almost a kind of irony. That is, anyone who has a dedicated practice kind of knows this stuff already. But in the world today, particularly from the global perspective, religion is not going to do it, which is why I say sometimes it's a hairdo and sometimes it's a hair don't. I have on a suit, but I also wore my little Buddhist robe, my rock suit today. So to just say, bridging worlds. And what I discovered in working in the medical system, that I really had to use not conventional spirituality as a way to leverage these processes, which have to do with training the mind, but also have to do with flourishing, with enlivening the body, that I couldn't do it from a conventional spiritual perspective. I'm a very pragmatic person, and so as a result of that, the perspective that opened up for me was using science as a way to leverage training programs. So here are just a few data points of many fascinating data points related to the value of compassion and why compassion is something that's really important for us today. The psychologist, social psychologist Paul Ekman recently noticed that Darwin was very, very clear that what ensures human survival is not the kind of fittestness that is associated with Darwin. It's actually Spencer's perspective. But actually, it's the survival of the kindest. How do we engender safety within our society, which is non-oppressive? How do we do that within our families, within our corporations, within our educational institutions? And there's more and more interesting data in this regard that's coming up. Like, for example, Laura Acton says children as young as 2 experience happiness more when they give treats than when they receive treats. Like it feels better to give than to receive. And Elizabeth Dunn, in her research, says that participants who actually spent money on others experienced much greater well-being than those who spent money on themselves. And this is the kind of face that you encounter in the Himalayas, a face that is just filled with goodwill. And Tanya Singer's work, Antoine Lutz, Richie Davidson, other people in the field have seen fascinatingly that compassion actually triggers this sense of well-being and the brain reward areas and the pleasure networks, and that it registers more in the brain, more like eating chocolate than Brussels sprouts. And that compassion has the capacity to actually be health-promoting, that it lowers inflammation, that it strengthens immune response, and it assists in recovery from illness. And according to various researchers, that compassion can actually enhance longevity by reducing stress, by engendering stronger social connections, which point to a 50% increase in the reduction of inflammation, in immune function, and much faster recovery from illness. And that volunteers, people who were helping other people, who became volunteers for purposes that were not self-serving, were actually living longer than their counterparts. And I have here a photograph of Nicholas Winton, and he's 105 years old. As some of you know, he, during the Second World War, saved the lives of 669 children in Czechoslovakia. And he's a remarkable example of, if you will, compassion without an agenda. In other words, no one really learned about what he had done in the Second World War until he was an older man and his wife discovered his journals in the attic. It's just really a powerful example of someone who has lived a long time and who engaged in compassion, but not from a point of view of self-serving. Compassion also affirms our moral principles. When we restrain compassion, our sense of moral identity is deeply compromised. And it elevates us when we engage in acts of compassion. And others who see us helping, being in service, also are inspired, also are elevated. And that it's contagious, which is kind of interesting. Acts of kindness actually beget more acts of kindness and a kind of chain reaction of goodness. And these outcomes point to the kind of essence of compassion: connectedness and meaning. And as I was preparing this talk, of course, you brought up in the former session the name of Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of the Holocaust. And his point is, meaningfulness means more than happiness. He says, being human always points and is directed to something or someone other than oneself. The more one forgets oneself by giving oneself to a cause to serve or another person to love, the more human one is. And then researchers Roy Baumeister and his colleagues say, by putting aside our selfish interest to serve someone or something larger than ourselves, by devoting our lives to giving rather than taking, we are not only expressing our fundamental humanity, but are also acknowledging that there is more to the good life than the pursuit of simple happiness. So that sense of meaning, of connection, those with strong social connections exemplified by compassion, living more robust lives. But let's do a little mapping of compassion, because as I said, understanding what compassion is really important in terms of being able to actualize compassion, train compassion in others. First, in coming off of Tenzin Priyadarshie's talk, he referenced non-transactional compassion. So compassion can be looked at as referential or non-referential. And the referential aspect of compassion has to do with compassion where there's an object. The non-referential or unbiased or universal sense of compassion is that sensibility that an individual is just pervaded with kindness, with care, with concern, and also with the readiness to respond to suffering. And so we're going to look just a little bit at common compassion, because non-referential or unbiased or non-transactional compassion is a little more inaccessible to us. But referential compassion is something that we see children engaging in, creatures, human beings. And this very simple list came to me. I was appointed as a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress, which was a real gift to me, to be in the Jefferson Building for some months, having the opportunity to have no agenda, no responsibility, simply to engage in thought experiments. And the reason why this thought experiment was so important to me, as I said, I have worked in the end-of-life care field now for 45 years and seen how deep the suffering clinicians experience in facing the challenges of caring for people with catastrophic illness, and also the cost to institutions and the cost to patients, not only to clinicians. And so I tried to do a map of compassion, and I began with the first thing. how important it is for us to actually have that capacity to attend to the experience of the suffering of others and to feel concern, very simply, to care, and then to sense in what might transform suffering, and then endeavoring to be of benefit. Very, very simple 4 points. There's also an important thing here, and that is the conflation or the confusion between empathy and compassion. You know, a certain way, Jeremy Rifkin's book, Brené Brown's work, certain people have pulled together compassion and empathy into a single category. But in actuality, these are two very different dimensions. Empathy refers to that experience of affective or emotional resonance. It's when we can sense into the experience of another. And it also refers to cognitive resonance, when we can kind of see out through the eyes of another. But clearly, people who have unregulated empathic responses experience personal distress, and as a result of that personal distress, become often quite ill. Compassion, though, is different. Compassion engages our capacity to attend, to feel concern, to actually sense in at the empathic level to the experience of others, but also there is this aspect of endeavoring to really want to change the conditions that we're involved with as we face suffering. So I asked myself the following questions when I was sitting at the Library of Congress. I said, can there be compassion and also retrospectively and principled leadership without attentional and affective balance? And no, the answer is no. That attention is required to really see things clearly. And affective balance, in other words, being free of empathic distress or moving away from skepticism, cynicism, antisocial mental processes, is really critical. Without having a sense of prosociality, of care, compassion is not possible. And then I asked myself, can there be compassion without an intention that's fundamentally altruistic, which is the desire to really be of service to others? And of course, that's not possible. And then the cognitive stream of, can there be compassion without insight? No. Insight is really important. For example, the social psychologist Daniel Batson saw clearly, and it was later reflected in the work of another social psychologist, Nancy Eisenberg, that the ability to distinguish self from other was critical in being able to experience healthy compassion. Being too much in this non-dual state, being too empathic, means falling into states of personal distress, of dysregulation, that disallows for compassion to be actualized. And yet, too much objectification is also an issue. So you're looking, if you will, for that point between the pairs of opposites. Extreme objectification or extreme identification, and you're trying to find that place where you're both feeling and seeing through the experience of others, and at the same time, you recognize clearly this person is not me at some level. And embodiment and engagement, the somatic dimension. And I just want to mention this because it was a fascinating point that came to my attention through Tanya Singer in a small meeting that was exploring compassion as a subject of research with Joseph Goldstein, your friend, and Amishi John, Richie Davidson, Dalai Lama, small group of us, Mathieu Ricard. And what Tanya shared with us, Dr. Singer shared with us, was the following. She said that people who suffer from alexithymia, an autism-related disorder, have very low capacity for sensing into their visceral processes. They can't really read heartbeat, know when they have to go to the bathroom, know when they're hungry, and so forth. And she did neural mapping of that experience of interoceptivity. Also, people who suffer from alexithymia have another feature that's really fascinating, and that is they have a very low capacity for empathy. It's very difficult for them to sense into the experience of another. And she put those maps together and saw that they overlapped. And what I realized when she said this was that the training of clinicians, the training of many people in corporations is so dissociated from the body that our capacity to have somatic sensitivity, to read our visceral processes, to be embodied, mirrors the capacity for us to sense into the experience of others. So your yoga outside, your stretching, these breaks that you give yourself in your work continuum are really essential in keeping us fundamentally embodied. And all these qualities that I've mentioned, attentional balance, affective balance, intention, insight, embodiment, and engagement are important for leadership. And then I began to look at the training of people in this field. And it was just a fascinating inquiry. I began to realize that compassion is actually composed of non-compassion elements that involve attention, as I've articulated, that involve affect, that involve certain cognitive processes, and involve embodiment. And what arises when these features interact with each other in the best of conditions is that compassion is primed. That compassion per se cannot be primed without having a really grounded approach to being in this present moment. It's not simply conceptual. It's also an embodied process. It's a process that is also cognitive and also as well affective. Year before last, or last year, I was in a meeting with the Dalai Lama, and I had this very funny experience, which is my job was to do a long presentation to His Holiness on the work that I had done in this heuristic map of compassion. And I remember we were in Kyoto, and I remember the night before going, oh my gosh, I have to present compassion material to the Dalai Lama. That is so weird. But anyway, His Holiness pointed out in the course of that meeting, and it was a much more extended and science-based presentation, but he pointed out in the course of that meeting that wisdom and compassion are two sides of the same coin. So I want us just to take a look at wisdom. And this is a meta-analysis on the neuroscience and social psychology of wisdom that was done by Dilip Jeste and Thomas Meeks. And what they articulate as wisdom, I think, is very interesting. The first aspect of wisdom that they identified is that, and this is so important in terms of leadership, is that wisdom means rising above self-interest, being a servant leader. It engages social decision-making, involving trust, altruism, reciprocity, and what is called context sensitivity. In other words, really sensing where you are in this moment. It also engages emotional balance, and it is essential, if you're a wise person, to have self-understanding, to familiarize yourself with your own mental continuum, how your mind operates, how your affective stream operates, and also to know the contents of the mind and your own conditioning in terms of self-understanding. Wisdom also points to valuing inclusiveness and the ability to deal effectively with ambiguity. So for me, this is all about qualities of leadership and being open to new experience and having the capacity to actually act in the face of uncertainty. Day before yesterday, I led a meditation, and the meditation has a somatic base, and it's very simple. Strong back exemplifies the quality of equanimity, of deep balance. Soft front exemplifies the quality of compassion or tenderness and openness. And it's exactly at this juncture of, if you will, equanimity and compassion where effective leaders emerge. So I just want to point to a very simple method, because it's one thing to map. It's another thing to have meaning and to have science all sort of priming and engaging this question of what is compassion and why is it relevant for leaders, but you need a method. And so I developed this very simple method, and I developed it primarily for clinicians. And it's very, very simple, but those of you who have a practice, I think it's most everybody in this room, will recognize that each one of these elements involve a very deep process. And Dr. Ari, you'll recognize this. The first is gathering our attention. How do we actually invite ourselves to be really grounded, to really be present? The second is recalling our intention, to understand the nature of our motivation, and to cultivate this quality of an altruistic heart. The third is to then attune to yourself first at the somatic, affective, and cognitive level before attuning to others, so you can recognize your biases, so you can see where you're at. And that self-attunement also primes the neural networks associated with perspective taking and with empathy. The C of grace is to consider what will really serve. And it's about this process of insight, of really looking deeply within. Is this just serving me because I'm presencing suffering and it's making me so uncomfortable and I feel like I need to order another round of chemotherapy or do something like that? And then the E of grace is to engage. Engage has two aspects. One is compassionate action. It's movement. And that movement forward is sometimes very small, sometimes it's just a mind movement, sometimes it's an actual action in the world. But it's primed by being grounded, by being ethically aligned, by deep self-attunement, by attunement into the other, also attunement into the whole system. For example, in healthcare, it's not just the patient that your decision as a clinician is going to rest with. Your decision as a clinician will rest with the interprofessional team, it will rest with family members, it's going to rest as well with your whole institution. So how do you consider what will serve from a systems perspective? And then finally, the second part of the E of grace is ending. It's very important that we know how to conclude an interaction, which involves a kind of inner acknowledgement of what has transpired, whether it's been great or small, or an interpersonal acknowledgement or an acknowledgement in our team. And that capacity to complete, to let go, to exhale. Sometimes if you're a clinician, it's the washing of the hands, where you're doing that ending process and then moving on to the next meeting, the next patient, and so forth. We all like to invoke the presence of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and these words have meant a lot to me over the years. Compassion is not religious business. It is human business. It's not a luxury. It's essential for our own peace and mental stability. It's essential for human survival. And it's good, as we have seen from the science, but also those of you who are engaged in some kind of work of service in the world. It's good for our kids, our communities, our corporations. It's good for our environment and the world. In fact, there's no downside to healthy compassion. And it's kind of the radicalism of our time. So what's my wish? My wish is for us to get radical. I think Google is pretty radical. I was really happy that Mark Zuckerberg did this amazing campaign for Nepal. I appreciate that Google matches the grants that are given by its members. Feel free. So in a certain way, Google, with Silly, has started a kind of leadership movement. And that leadership movement, for me, has to do with principled engagement in the world, not simple engagement, deeply principled engagement in the world, engagement at the level of compassion. And what do I want from you? I want us to disrupt distractions and engage compassion and spread the news that compassion is a sane, healthy, collaborative, radical necessity for leadership. How? I took out the photograph of Bill Gates, by the way, scratching his head, but never mind. I thought it might be a little, well, whatever. So there's a fifth step, and that is motivation and engagement. Our corporations, I feel, will be healthy if we engage compassion. The people in our communities, in corporations, in business, will be better if we see the leaders of our institutions engaging in acts of compassion. So I'm asking us to vow now, to act, and to be a model for the world of compassion in action. And let's together explore how our global community and present and future leaders can create greater means for responsible social and environmental engagement by reframing compassion to benefit our world. And these are the things that I feel are important for us to do: to protect our earth, to protect the lives of children, to protect the rights of the dying, to give refuge to refugees, to actually get out there in the world apart from the beautiful buildings where so many of you work, and to volunteer inside the prisons, to address racism and classism in our culture, to look to women for leadership, and to build community and a just economic order, and end war, and to be a peacemaker. That's what I need from you. I need for you to make compassion viral for the present, but also for the future of our world, for the benefit of our children, and to live this. For as long as space remains and as long as beings remain, may I too remain to dispel the suffering of the world. Thank you.